How did a silent African empire once rule the land of the pharaohs? How could a civilization rise in the shadows of Egypt's golden temples, shape its destiny for centuries, and then sink almost without a sound beneath the desert's breath? Was it truly silence, or have we simply forgotten how to listen? Beneath the burning skies of Nubia, where the Nile bends south and the sand turns to iron dust, there once lived a people who spoke to the gods through stone. Their pyramids were smaller yet sharper. Their queens were warriors. Their kings, guardians of mysteries the North would later claim as its own. They called their home Kush, and though history has buried their names beneath Egyptian hieroglyphs and Roman dust, their echoes remain, in ruins that hum softly at dusk, in symbols carved on black granite, in the unbroken rhythm of the river that once crowned them sovereigns of two worlds. Tonight we travel not by map, but by memory. We will drift through time's long corridor, following whispers of forgotten temples, traders, and queens. Let the noise of the modern world fade. Let the sands of ancient Nubia settle around your thoughts, because sometimes the quietest kingdoms speak the loudest truths. Welcome to the Cryptic Realm channel. If stories of lost civilizations calm your mind and awaken your wonder, subscribe and journey with us into the deep silence of history. Now let us begin with the first breath of the Kingdom of Kush. The desert is not truly silent. If you stand long enough by the banks of the Nile, deep in the heart of what is now northern Sudan, you will hear it breathe. The sand murmurs as it moves, the river hums against its own stones, and somewhere in the distance, wind stirs through ruins that were never meant to vanish. This is the land that once bore the name Kush, a name older than empire, older even than memory. Here, the Nile does not flow with the calm authority it shows in Egypt. It twists and folds upon itself as if hesitating. It is a river of questions. Why did life choose to begin again here after traveling so far from the cradle of the North? The terrain around it is fierce. Granite hills scarred with veins of gold and iron. Plains so dry that breath itself feels like dust. Yet it was this severity that drew the first people thousands of years before the pharaohs built their cities of stone. Archaeologists have traced their footprints in the sand. The cultures of Kerma, Sai, and Napata, names whispered by scholars half lost between fact and mirage. Around 2500 BCE, when Egypt's pyramids gleamed under a new sun, the people of Kush were already shaping their own world of cattle, copper, and river reeds. Their huts of mud and wood lined the river banks. Their songs, though gone, must have carried across the water like low prayers to unseen gods. The land itself demanded reverence. Each flood of the Nile was a promise and a warning. To the Kushite farmers, the river was not merely a resource. It was a being, a pulse of the cosmos. Its seasonal rhythms carved the calendar. Its capriciousness sculpted faith. In the nights of endless stars, they looked upward and saw the sky mirrored in the dark water, and perhaps wondered if their souls too would one day flow northward, carried by the current toward the lands of the pharaohs. Long before history learned to write their names, the people of Kush learned to listen. To the whisper of wind across stone, to the beating of drums echoing through dry valleys, to the silent logic of survival. They mined copper from the red earth. They hunted along the savannas. They forged tools that gleamed like fragments of the sun. Traces of their pottery, smooth, black-topped, burnished by fire, still gleam beneath the dust, testifying to a craft both practical and sacred. Yet even in this early age, something deeper stirred. The archaeological sites of Kerma reveal not just homes but sanctuaries, temples built from mud brick, arranged with deliberate geometry, oriented to celestial lines. Beneath them, burial chambers filled with cattle skulls, ivory, and carnelian beads. Death to these people was not an ending but a threshold. Their tombs face the west, where the sun descends carrying the spirit into the realm of ancestors. In that gesture lies a philosophy, that all things return to silence, but none are truly lost within it. When Egyptian envoys first traveled south, perhaps seeking gold or slaves, they must have been surprised by what they found. Not a wilderness, but a society already proud, already ancient in its own right. The Egyptians called the region Ta Seti, the land of the bow, for its warriors were famed archers whose arrows could sing across a battlefield before the enemy ever saw their faces. Even then, the Kushites were both neighbors and enigmas, too distant to control, too rich to ignore. Trade began as cautious exchange, ivory for linen, incense for grain. But beneath the surface, each civilization studied the other. Egypt saw in Kush a reflection of its own origins, as if gazing backward through time. Kush saw in Egypt a glimpse of what it might yet become. A world of gods carved in stone, of order drawn from chaos. Between them stretched not only desert but destiny, and in the ages to come that destiny would entwine them until neither could remember where one ended and the other began. For now, though, Kush remained quiet, a civilization still forming, still listening to the hum of its own heart. Around its temples, acacia trees dropped golden dust on sacred ground. Herds of cattle moved in slow procession toward the water, their bells chiming like prayer. In the night, fires burned along the river, and the people of Kush told stories of spirits who walked between the stars and the dunes. They spoke of Amun, the hidden god of air and silence, of Apedemak, the lion-faced lord of war, of mothers who dreamed of sons destined to rule not just Nubia but Egypt itself. The ground beneath them held secrets that even now we barely understand. Beneath the ruins of Kerma, excavations have revealed monumental walls 10 meters thick, enclosing what scholars call the Western Defufa, a temple fortress of sun-dried brick, its walls once painted in ochre and white. Within, the remains of altars and stairways suggest a faith already reaching for the divine through architecture, a prelude to the grandeur that would later echo in Meroë and Napata. From these foundations, the kingdom of Kush would rise, carrying the memory of its earthbound gods into an empire of silence and splendor. Yet as we drift deeper into this ancient landscape, one question lingers. Why did a people surrounded by so much harshness choose to build beauty instead of fear? What is it that makes civilizations emerge from struggle rather than submission? The wind answers with no words, only movement, sand shifting like thought, erasing footprints, then revealing them again. Somewhere beyond the bend of the river, another dawn is waiting. The dawn when Kush will no longer be the pupil of Egypt, but its shadow, its rival, and for a brief and shining century, its ruler. The silence of the desert was never meant to last. From the north came a light so blinding it reshaped the horizon. Banners of gold, spears of copper, and the measured rhythm of conquest. Egypt had awakened into its age of empire, and its eyes, long fixed on the sun, turned south toward the dark hills of Nubia. The pharaohs had learned that the land of Kush shimmered with more than mirage. It held gold enough to gild eternity itself. At first they came as explorers, map-makers tracing the Nile's bends and naming what had already been named by tongues older than their own. But curiosity turned quickly to hunger. The vast temples of Egypt demanded offerings. Stone, incense, tribute, labor, to maintain the illusion of divine order. Beyond the first cataract, Kush glittered with promise. Mines of gold, veins of copper, caravans bearing ivory and ebony, all flowing through a corridor of narrow valleys guarded by men with the bows of Ta-Siti. The Egyptians called these people Nehesi, the Southerners. In their relief carvings, the Kushites are shown with dark skin, proud faces, and feathered crowns. To Egypt, they were both kin and quarry, descendants of a shared river but born in a harsher cradle. During the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, Pharaoh Senusret III marched south and built a chain of fortresses that still rise from the dust today. Buhan, Semna, Uronarti, outposts of stone watching over the turbulent waters. Their walls, now collapsed, once bore inscriptions measuring the Nile's flood and marking Egypt's dominion. No Nubian shall pass this point except to trade or serve. And yet, even as Egypt claimed the land, the people of Kush endured. They adapted as the desert always does. They watched the invaders build temples to gods whose names sounded strangely familiar. Amun, Ra, Isis, and they whispered those names in their own tongue, folding foreign myths into native soil. Archaeologists now find Egyptian scarabs buried alongside Kushite pottery, fragments of hieroglyphs carved beside older symbols we still cannot read. What began as conquest slowly became a conversation written in two scripts. Beneath this uneasy peace, a transformation was taking place. Egyptian rule reached deep, but it did not erase. It stirred something older. The Kushites learned the art of stone architecture, the mathematics of temples, the discipline of centralized power. In return, Egypt absorbed their resilience, their archery, their sense of sacred silence. Cultures do not collide without leaving echoes in each other. In the ruins of Semna, a stela of Senusret III still speaks in the voice of warning. Every Nubian who shall pass beyond this fortress, his life shall be forfeit. But perhaps even then there were smiles behind the walls. Merchants passing quietly, soldiers exchanging gifts, children born between the two worlds. History and truth is never as absolute as its inscriptions pretend. By the time Egypt's Middle Kingdom faded, the empire of Kush had learned to endure beneath the shadow of another's greatness. Yet the Nile is patient, and power flows like water. It always seeks a new course. When Egypt entered its second intermediate period, torn by foreign rulers and internal doubt, the forts along the Nubian border grew silent. The Egyptian garrisons withdrew. The walls of Buhan crumbled into sand, and into that silence Kush returned, not as a victim but as something reborn. In the ashes of occupation rose the city of Napata, nestled beneath the sacred mountain Gebel Barkal, whose sandstone peak pierced the sky like the finger of a god. It was said that Amun himself dwelled there, whispering to the wind, priests of Napata began to speak his name with growing confidence, claiming that the divine breath of Amun had not abandoned Egypt. It had migrated south to its true home. It was more than theology. It was defiance disguised as faith. While Egypt struggled to find itself again, Kush quietly rebuilt its temples, its herds, its armies. Artifacts from this time show a blend of styles: Egyptian motifs carved with Nubian hands, lotus petals entwined with lions, royal seals bearing titles in both hieroglyphs and the early forms of Meroitic script. In every stroke of chisel, one can sense a question forming. If Egypt could once rule Kush, could not Kush one day rule Egypt? For now, however, they waited. Generations passed beneath the shadow of Gebel Barkal. The old warriors of Kerma were long gone, replaced by kings whose names survive only in fragments. Alara, Kashta, ancestors of a line that would soon stride northward into history. They built tombs modeled on Egyptian pyramids, but smaller, steeper, more precise. Symbols not of imitation, but of mastery over form. The architecture of Kush was learning to speak its own dialect again. When Egyptian travelers ventured south in those centuries, they found not ruins, but revival. Napata had become a sanctuary of Amun, drawing pilgrims from distant valleys. Statues of the god stood with the calm dignity of memory reclaimed. The priests there spoke of destiny as though it were a river changing course. Slow, inevitable, guided by divine current. To them, Egypt's weakness was not tragedy but invitation. The silence of Kush was no longer submission, it was preparation. And somewhere in that silence, a dream was taking shape. A vision of a time when the sons of Nubia would wear the crowns of both lands. But the world beyond was changing. To the north, new kings rose in Thebes, men who would one day call themselves the New Kingdom. They looked upon their past conquests and hungered for restoration. Gold, ivory, soldiers, all the wealth of Kush beckoned them again. The line of pharaohs prepared their return, bringing not only armies but gods to reclaim what they believed was theirs. The calm along the Nile darkened. Traders carried more weapons than grain. Temples burned offerings with unfamiliar haste. And somewhere in the heart of Napata, an oracle may have whispered to a king that soon the Nile would run red again, and that silence, once broken, would never be the same. The silence broke once more. Not with words, but with the drumbeat of empire returning. The north had awakened again. From the sands of Thebes marched armies carrying banners of the falcon god Horus, their chariots glinting beneath the relentless Nubian sun. Egypt's new kingdom had risen, and with it came a hunger to reclaim what time and weakness had allowed to slip away. When Pharaoh Thutmose I crossed the first cataract around 1500 BCE, he brought with him not merely soldiers, but the conviction of divine order. To the Egyptians, the south was chaos, a realm to be subdued so the balance of Ma'at, the cosmic harmony, could be restored. Yet for the people of Kush, this harmony was not lost. It simply sang in another tone. Still, the Nile listened to neither side. It flowed, indifferent, carrying the echo of spears. The battles that followed left little written memory in Kushite tongues. For writing itself had yet to take hold as script. What survives comes from Egyptian walls, where the victors carved their own version of truth. Reliefs from the tomb of Thutmose at Thebes show rows of bound Nubians, their features rendered with both artistry and distance. Beneath the surface of those carvings lies a paradox. Admiration and conquest intertwined. The Egyptians feared the Kushite bowmen whose arrows could pierce armor from beyond sight. They envied the gold and cattle of the south, yet they also absorbed its spirit, the desert's quiet resilience. After Thutmose's campaign, Egypt established dominion deep into Nubia, extending its frontier beyond the Fourth Cataract. Fortresses rose again along the river, but now they bore temples as well as walls. The city of Napata, once the whispering sanctuary beneath Gebel Barkal, became an Egyptian holy site. The pharaohs declared the mountain itself the dwelling of Amun, the hidden god, linking it forever with the Theban deity they served. Thus began the great paradox of Kush. Conquered yet sanctified, subdued yet made sacred. In time, the occupation changed shape. Egyptian officials ruled from grand residences built upon Nubian soil. Statues of pharaohs stood over local marketplaces, and the language of decrees turned to hieroglyphs. But beneath the foreign rule, life continued to breathe in old rhythms. Villagers still offered prayers in their own tongue, still buried their dead with cattle skulls and desert flowers. The invaders had come to rule, but slowly, imperceptibly. They were being absorbed by the land itself. Archaeologists have uncovered its Soleb and Amara West temples built by pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramses II. Their stones are cut with perfect precision, their columns lined with carvings of gods both Egyptian and Nubian. In one relief, the lion-headed deity Apetamak stands beside Amun, their hands almost touching, as though the artisans themselves sensed the merging of pantheons. On the temple floors, offerings of gold leaf and ostrich feathers tell of rituals that blended north and south, light and shadow, conqueror and conquered. To the Egyptian governors, this fusion was proof of empire's strength. To the Kushites, it was something quieter: inheritance. Children born in this era spoke Egyptian in the courts and Nubian in their homes. Priests from Thebes married local women and found themselves praying to gods whose names they could not fully translate. Every brick, every carving, every ceremony carried both voices now, the dialect of empire and the murmur of the Nile. And then came the priests of Amun. Their influence grew like the floodwaters, slow, powerful, unstoppable. In Egypt, they were already rivals to pharaohs themselves. In Kush, their temples became the heart of daily life. The cult of Amun at Gebel Barkal drew pilgrims from both sides of the border. Offerings filled the sanctuaries: gold bracelets, copper mirrors, delicately worked incense burners shaped like lotus blooms. The priests spoke of divine unity, of a God who moved between lands as the Nile did. Their theology softened the edges of conquest, and in that softness, the idea of a new identity began to germinate. Over generations, the Egyptian grip weakened. The long reign of Ramses II marked both a height and a decline. His colossal statues watched over Nubian towns, yet behind their calm faces, the empire was beginning to crack. Wars in the north, rebellions, economic strain, each pulled Egypt's gaze away from the south. The garrisons along the Nile grew thin. The temples, once gleaming with gold, fell to disrepair. And in the quiet that followed, Kush listened. Somewhere in the sands of Napata, perhaps beneath the gaze of Gebel Barkal, elders began to whisper of destiny. The Egyptians had brought their gods, their scripts, their architecture, but the soul of those things had taken root here, not in Thebes. The true Amun, they began to say, now spoke from the south. His breath no longer rose from the delta, but from the red heart of Nubia. The remnants of Egyptian rule became seeds of transformation. Out of temples once guarded by foreign soldiers emerged native priests, born of Kushite blood, fluent in the dual languages of heaven and earth. Out of the administrative centers rose leaders who could read hieroglyphs yet dream in Nubian rhythm. And from their faith in the sanctity of Gabel Barkal came a new kind of legitimacy. The conviction that kingship itself was a divine inheritance waiting to be reclaimed. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt's empire withdrew once more. The sands moved in, burying fortresses and records alike. To Egyptian chroniclers, Nubia was a distant province fading into the horizon. To Kush, it was the moment between breaths, the stillness before revival. The temples remained empty yet echoing with invisible hymns. The statues of Amun stood unbroken, their eyes turned toward the north as if waiting for a question that would one day be answered. And so the land grew quiet again. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of gestation, of something ancient stirring beneath centuries of dust. In that long hush, Kush was not dying. It was remembering, learning how to shape empire from memory, how to turn subjugation into foundation. The Nile kept its rhythm. Seasons of flood and drought passed like heartbeats. And within that patient pulse, the descendants of those once conquered began to dream of crowns, of temples, of songs that would be sung in their own tongue. The empire of Egypt had come and gone, but the spirit it sought to dominate had only deepened. The desert listened once more, and in that listening the Silent Kingdom began to rise again. When an empire withdraws, it leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves patterns, roads that remember footsteps, temples that retain echoes of prayer, languages that still hum beneath new tongues. In the long dusk that followed Egypt's retreat, Kush inherited not just its conqueror's stones, but its silence. And from that silence, something remarkable began to stir. The Egyptian garrisons had vanished, their fortresses swallowed by sand. The last scribes packed their papyrus scrolls and drifted northward, leaving temples half-finished, altars untended. Yet the god they had carried with them, Amun, the invisible, did not depart. His presence clung to Gebel Barkal, that sacred mountain whose shadow stretched over Napata like a blessing. For the people of Kush, Amun was no longer a foreign deity. He was the breath that moved through their own lungs, the unseen source of kingship waiting to be reclaimed. Archaeological layers tell this story in silence. Beneath later ruins, fragments of pottery and votive offerings mark a gradual rebirth. By around 1000 BCE, Napata had grown into the spiritual and political heart of a new kingdom. Independent, self-assured, and steeped in both Egyptian memory and Nubian pride. The priests of Amun became counselors and visionaries, keepers of an invisible crown. And from their ranks, or perhaps from families long loyal to them, arose a line of rulers whose names began to carve themselves into stone once more. The first of these remembered kings is Alara, a figure half shadow, half substance. No contemporary inscription bears his name, yet later Kushite records speak of him with reverence as founder and restorer, the one who reawakened the sacred line. Some scholars believe his reign began near the end of the 10th century BCE, when Egypt itself was divided among warlords and high priests. Where the north saw decline, the south saw opportunity. Alara's power did not come from conquest, but from continuity. He understood the rhythm of the Nile and the faith that flowed with it. Rather than rejecting Egypt's heritage, he claimed it as his own. Under his guidance, the temples of Napata were repaired, the rites of Amun renewed, and local chiefs bound together by ritual rather than force. In a world collapsing into fragments, Alara offered form, a vision of unity drawn from silence. His successor, Kashta, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a question. Could Kush, once the subject of pharaohs, now become their equal? Kashta's inscriptions, faint and scarce, suggest a man aware of destiny's gravity. He extended influence northward, establishing ties with Thebes itself, where Egypt's 23rd dynasty clung to power amid uncertainty. The boundary between the two lands was no longer defined by swords, but by faith. Priests at Thebes and Napata worshipped the same god, Amun, though each claimed his true home lay within their own temple walls. It was through this sacred diplomacy that Kashta achieved what armies could not. He married the divine to the political, securing recognition of Kushite kingship within the Egyptian religious hierarchy. One inscription in Thebes refers to Kashta, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. A title likely ceremonial, but one that foreshadowed what was to come. Through prayer and patience, the Silent Kingdom had placed its voice once more upon the northern wind. Life in Kush thrived beneath this quiet consolidation. The Nile's floodplains fed herds and crops. Trade caravans wound through deserts carrying gold, ivory, and incense toward the Mediterranean. Women held prominent roles, both in temple life and governance. Queens, known as Kandak, stood beside their husbands not as shadows but as sovereigns in their own right. The iconography from this period, scarabs, pottery, temple reliefs, shows them wearing the vulture headdress of divine motherhood, their eyes wide and calm as if gazing both backward and forward through time. The kingdom's art began to change too. The heavy idealism of Egyptian sculpture softened into something more human, more immediate. Faces bore fuller lips, broader noses. Posture gave way to grace. The temples of Napata and Kawa filled with offerings carved in black granite and red sandstone. Hieroglyphic inscriptions mingled with early Nubian symbols, an alphabet still forming in the cradle of two worlds. Yet the Nile, ever restless, does not allow stillness for long. Egypt, weakened though it was, had not vanished. To the north, rival dynasties jostled for control, Libyan princes, priestly families, and foreign adventurers, each claiming to uphold the legacy of the pharaohs. Amid this chaos, Kush grew in confidence, watching from the margins like a star gathering light before it breaks dawn. Kashta's daughter, Amenirtis, would become a bridge between these realms. Sent to Thebes as a priestess of Amun, she embodied the union of two civilizations. Her installation was not merely religious. It was political theater of the highest kind. In placing a Kushite woman at the heart of Egypt's most sacred cult, Kashta had achieved influence beyond any army's reach. Through Amenirtis, the god of Thebes now spoke with a Nubian accent. Archaeologists studying temple walls in Thebes and Napata note the synchrony of this period. Identical rituals, mirrored architecture, shared iconography. It is as though two hearts beat to the same pulse, one slightly stronger, the other listening. The stage was being set for something the ancient world could scarcely imagine, a reversal of empire. When Kashta died, his son Piye inherited not just a throne, but a prophecy. The oracles of Gebel Barkal had long whispered of a time when Amun's chosen would unite the two lands once again. Not from the north, as in ages past, but from the south. The temple bells rang with that dream, and as Piye stood before the mountain's shadow, he must have felt the weight of both ancestry and silence pressing upon him. The world beyond Kush was changing quickly. To the north, Egyptian princes quarreled among themselves, Assyrian armies stirred in Mesopotamia, trade routes shifted under the pressures of greed and fear. But within Napata, the people of Kush prepared with quiet certainty. Their fields yielded abundance, their temples resounded with hymns older than memory. The lion god Apetamak guarded their borders, and Amun's priests spoke of destiny as if it were already written in the dust. And so, out of centuries of subjugation, the Silent Kingdom had learned to listen until the time was right to speak. Soon its kings would march north not as conquerors born of vengeance, but as heirs reclaiming what the river had always promised them. The pharaohs of Egypt would wear dark crowns again, crowns forged in the heart of Nubia, polished by the same sun that had once seen them fall. The silence was breaking once more, but this time it belonged to Kush. When the wind changed over Napata, the priests said it was the breath of Amun calling northward. The oracles at Gebel Barkal had long whispered of a time when the god's chosen son would rise from the desert to restore balance to the world. Piye listened in silence. He was a man of contemplation, not boast. Broad-shouldered, patient, his eyes fixed on the slow curve of the Nile as though reading a prophecy written in water. Egypt, by then, was a house divided. From Thebes to the Delta, petty kings squabbled over what was left of empire. In the north, the Libyan dynasts of the 22nd and 23rd dynasties ruled like landlords of broken estates. In the south, the priests of Amun struggled to keep the old rites alive. Between them stretched a land weary of crowns. Each ruler claimed divine sanction, yet none could still the noise of their own ambition. To the people of Kush, that noise sounded like opportunity, the moment when silence could finally speak. Piye's armies were not vast, but they were disciplined, forged in the measured rhythm of Nubian command. Their horses, sleek and restless, had been bred along the grasslands near Dongola. Their chariots were lighter than those of Egypt, their archers famed for striking before the enemy could draw breath. But Piye's weapon was not steel, it was faith. He marched under banners bearing the ram-headed image of Amun, believing himself not conqueror but restorer of order. In the year we mark roughly as 730 BCE, the king of Kush began his northern journey. His own inscription, carved later on a great stela found at Gebel Barkal, records his thoughts in language both restrained and serene. He writes of purity before battle, how he fasted, washed in river water, refused to eat until he had offered prayers. "The strong arm of Amun is with me," the stone declares. "I am his living image. He gives me victory over all lands." It is not the boast of a tyrant, but the vow of a believer who sees conquest as ceremony. The campaign unfolded like the slow advance of floodwater. City after city yielded not to fear but to inevitability. At Hermopolis, the garrison opened its gates. At Heracleopolis, the local ruler offered tribute. Pa accepted their oaths, demanded offerings to Amun, and left their temples intact. He called his enemies those who ignore the god's command rather than infidels, a subtle difference that made submission an act of repentance rather than defeat. Only in the Delta did resistance gather weight. The Libyan prince Tefnacht, lord of Sais, united the northern nomes under his banner and sent word that he would drive the Nubian back beyond the cataracts. Yet when Paye's forces reached Memphis, the ancient heart of Egypt, the defenders found themselves fighting not a foreign invader but an echo of their own past. The Kushite king ordered the purification of his troops before assaulting the walls. He forbade plunder of temples and spared those who prayed to Amun. The battle raged for days, chariots clashing amid dust and prayer. At last, Memphis fell, not to destruction but to reverence. Pa entered the city in silence, his head bowed beneath incense smoke as if stepping into a sanctuary rather than a conquest. The stela tells us that the northern princes came in procession to kneel before him, bringing gold, lapis, and royal seals. They touched the ground before his sandals and called him Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. And in that gesture the prophecy of Gebel Barkal became flesh. The south had become the north, the once silent kingdom now the voice of the Nile itself. Yet Pa did not linger among the thrones he had gathered. After uniting the two lands, he turned away from the glitter of the delta and journeyed home. The Egyptians found this incomprehensible. Why claim the world and then abandon it? But Pa's purpose was not empire, it was restoration. His task, as he saw it, was to remind Egypt of its own forgotten divinity, then retreat before arrogance could follow. Back in Napata, he offered thanks to Amun and recorded his victories not as personal triumphs, but as the god's fulfillment. The art and architecture of Kush blossomed in his wake. Temples rose along the Nile, adorned with reliefs that showed Paye receiving the Ankh of life from the ram-headed Amun of Nubia. The lines between Egyptian and Kushite form dissolved completely. Hieroglyphs mingled with Nubian motifs, lotus petals with lions, pharaonic crowns with local headdresses of ostrich feathers. It was no longer imitation. It was synthesis, the birth of something new and self-aware. His successors would build upon this legacy. Shabaka, Pa's brother, would later rule both Egypt and Kush from Memphis, establishing what history calls the 25th dynasty, though the Kushites themselves saw no division of number or name. To them it was simply the continuation of Ma'at, the world set right again under Amun's gaze. They restored temples long neglected, revived ancient texts, even copied the pyramid texts onto new stone as if stitching time itself back together. In Egyptian history books, the reign of the Ethiopian pharaohs, as later writers would call them, appears as a brief interlude between eras of turmoil. But in the rhythm of the Nile, it was a moment of alignment, a heartbeat of unity when North and South remembered they were one body. Pa had not only conquered, he had reminded civilization of its own reflection in the mirror of the desert. Yet beneath the harmony, shadows lengthened. Far to the northeast, Assyria's empire expanded like a storm front, its armies clad in iron, its kings speaking in the language of domination. Egypt's fragile peace would not last. and Kush's dream of spiritual restoration would soon be tested by the blunt weight of the world's next great power. For now, though, the Nile ran calm. At Napata, priests lit lamps before the temple of Amun. Their flames mirrored in the river like a constellation returned to earth. The people sang hymns to Paye, the king who had conquered by faith, not cruelty. The ruler who had marched through chaos only to restore silence. And as night fell over Gebel Barkal, the wind whispered again across the stones the voice of a god content for a time with the order of his creation. The crown that Paye had returned to Napata was not a trophy but a burden, a golden circle humming with memory. When his brother Shabaka inherited it, the Nile was already shifting again, restless beneath the calm. Egypt, newly unified, needed a ruler strong enough to bind its divided heart. And so Shabaka journeyed north, not as a conqueror following a prophecy, but as a craftsman repairing a broken instrument, tuning the notes of empire to the key of faith. Where Paye had been contemplative, Shabaka was decisive. In him, the quiet conviction of Kush took on the form of governance. He ruled both Egypt and Nubia as one body, his capitals mirroring each other, Memphis to the north, Napata to the south, like the two lungs of the same divine being. His inscriptions speak less of battle than of building, restoring temples, reopening canals, commissioning stone where time had left only dust. "I found the monuments of the ancestors in ruin," he wrote. "I have rebuilt them in the name of the gods." It was a statement of duty, not pride, a belief that the act of creation itself was worship. The age that followed is often called a Renaissance, a brief golden interval when art, theology, and politics found harmony once more. In Egypt, the old texts were recopied onto fresh papyrus. The hymns of the Pyramid Age were sung again after centuries of silence. In Nubia, the same chants rose in temples carved from sandstone, their echoes joined by the wind that had always carried prayer along the desert's edge. The 25th dynasty called itself the Sons of Amun, and they ruled as if the god's breath truly filled their lungs. Shabaka's court in Memphis was unlike any Egypt had seen in generations. Nubian nobles in plaited hair and leopard skin stood beside Egyptian scribes with ink-stained fingers. The queen, often depicted wearing both the Uraeus serpent and the vulture crown, presided not from behind but beside the throne. In their portraits, the royal family's features are unmistakably African. Broad faces, calm eyes, lips curved with that serene authority found only in those who have endured. To later chroniclers, they were Ethiopians, as though the South itself had risen to judge the North. But to their own people, they were pharaohs, restorers of Maat, the sacred balance. Under Shabaka, the Kushite sense of reverence met Egyptian formality, producing art of remarkable stillness. Reliefs from his reign show gods and kings locked in symmetrical grace, every line deliberate, every gesture devotional. In the temple of Karnak, the columns were recarved, their hieroglyphs deepened as if to anchor eternity more firmly to the stone. The old myths were gathered and harmonized, and from this effort emerged a single document, the Shabaka stone, a basalt slab engraved with what we now call the Memphite theology. It tells how the world was created not by hands, but by speech, how the god Ptah conceived all things in his heart and brought them forth with his tongue. In that doctrine lies an echo of the Kushite spirit itself, that creation begins in silence, then becomes sound. Beyond theology, the Nile's commerce flourished. Gold from Nubia, incense from Punt, lapis from the east, all flowed through the renewed arteries of empire. Egyptian artisans worked beside Kushite smiths, fusing their crafts, ivory inlaid with copper, faience beads shaped into lions and lotus flowers, funerary masks tinted with reddish pigment from Nubian earth. It was not imitation but dialogue, a civilization speaking with two accents yet one meaning. Still, on the far horizon, another voice was rising. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire gathered power like thunder behind mountains. Its kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, saw themselves as chosen of their own fierce god, lords of iron and inscription. They recorded their victories on stone panels showing endless rows of captives, cities burning, rivers dyed red. Theirs was an empire built not on balance but on fear. And in the markets of Thebes, merchants whispered of their approach, of armies that ground nations into silence. Shabaka knew of them, though they were still distant. He strengthened Egypt's defenses, fortified its borders, and forged alliances through faith rather than diplomacy. Yet even within, fissures began to form. Egypt's nobles, long accustomed to autonomy, bristled under Kushite authority. Some whispered that their pharaoh, dark of skin and foreign of tongue, ruled by heaven's accident, not its design. But Shabaka answered not with decree but with action. He rebuilt Memphis' great temple of Ptah, restored the Serapeum, reopened quarries that had slept for generations. Each stone laid was an argument more eloquent than any proclamation. In Napata, the sacred fires burned without pause. Messengers traveled between the two capitals, carrying tablets of prayer and orders of state. Queens, sisters, daughters, mothers served as priestesses of Amun, ensuring that divine favor flowed both ways. Among them was Amunirdist Set, niece of Piye, whose name would appear on temple walls beside those of the gods. In this weaving of family and faith lay the quiet genius of Kushite rule, kingship as devotion, governance as ritual. The people along the Nile felt it too. Farmers spoke of good floods, merchants of fair trade, artisans of steady work. The old terror of famine receded, replaced by the calm rhythm of seasons returning as they should. In those years, perhaps, the Nile itself seemed to breathe easier, its waters reflecting a sky untroubled by omen. But power, like the river, is never still. To the north, Assyria turned its gaze toward the Levant, crushing cities one by one until its armies reached the borders of Egypt's vassal states. Refugees brought tales of siege engines, iron-tipped arrows, gods carved with wings and claws. The Kushite pharaohs knew that their silence would soon be challenged by a roar from beyond the desert. In their temples, the priests of Amun began to offer new prayers, not for conquest, but for endurance. Shabaka reigned for decades, and when he died, the Nile wept in flood. His successors would inherit both his grandeur and his burden. Among them rose Shabitku, then Taharka, men of faith and fire who would carry Kush's name into battle against the greatest empire of their age. But for now, the land rested in fragile harmony. The temples gleamed, the hymns rose, and the memory of silence grew thin beneath the weight of approaching thunder. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the first Assyrian scouts had already begun to chart the southern road. There are kings who inherit thrones and kings who inherit destinies. Taharka, son of Pie and successor to Shebitku, was both. When he ascended the throne around 690 BCE, the Nile was again at its full strength. The temples gleamed, and the two lands, Kush and Egypt, were united under the banner of Amun. The priests spoke of him as the living breath of the god, chosen to keep the balance of Maat in an age already trembling with distant thunder. The chronicles remember him as the builder king, the warrior philosopher, the ruler whose hands shaped both stone and destiny. Even the Hebrew Bible names him, Tirhaka, king of Ethiopia, as a sovereign whose armies once stood against Assyria. Yet behind these fragments of history lies a man whose reign was both triumph and prelude to loss. In the first years of his rule, Taharqa turned not to war but to creation. From Napata to Memphis, from Thebes to the cataracts of the Nubian desert, he ordered temples restored, canals dredged, gardens planted, and shrines raised in the name of Amun. The scale of his vision was vast. At Kawa, on the eastern bank of the Nile, he built sanctuaries lined with ram-headed sphinxes. At Gabel Barkal, he expanded the holy precinct, carving colossal statues whose gaze still watches the horizon. His inscriptions speak not of conquest but of harmony. I have made the earth to bloom again. The god rejoices in my works. Art from his time carries a rare duality, an elegance that belongs to Egypt and a strength that belongs to Kush. His statues, carved from diorite and granite, show a face broad and calm, lips full, eyes heavy with thought. The features are unmistakably African, yet the expression transcends identity. It is the face of a ruler who sees time itself as his subject. The temples of Thebes, Karnak, and Luxor still bear his cartouches, often side by side with those of ancestors long dead, as if Taharqa wished to link the present not only to his lineage but to the ancient gods themselves. Yet no peace endures in the world of empires. Beyond the Sinai, the Assyrian kings had grown restless again. Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon inherited not only an empire but an obsession to extend his dominion to the Nile. The Assyrians saw Egypt as the last jewel, the final frontier where the sun of conquest might set. Their messengers rode west with demands for tribute. Their scribes recorded prophecies of victory written in blood. To them, Taharqa's Egypt was a rival too proud to kneel. When news reached Memphis that Assyria's armies had crossed into the Levant, Taharqa did not hesitate. He led his chariots north, joining the small kingdoms that stood as buffer between empires, Tyre, Judah, and others whose names echo faintly in both history and scripture. For a brief moment, the desert winds carried rumors of alliance, of the Kushite pharaoh as savior of nations. But alliances in that age were fragile, and Assyria's advance relentless. The first clash came near the borders of Palestine. The Assyrians fought like the desert storms they worshipped, swift, iron, and merciless. Yet Taharqa's warriors were not easily broken. Their bows sang from the dunes, their chariots wheeled through dust like thunder. The chronicles of Esarhaddon boast of victory. Egyptian reliefs claim triumph. Truth, as always, flows somewhere between. The campaign ended not in conquest, but in stalemate. The kind of silence that hides exhaustion beneath dignity. But the storm would return. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon launched a second invasion greater than before. Tens of thousands of men, siege engines, cavalry, and the weight of empire pressed southward. The Assyrian annals call it the conquest of Meroë and Kush. They record Memphis taken, Taharka's family captured, the pharaoh himself fleeing to Thebes and beyond. Yet even in retreat his spirit did not yield. To the Kushites, withdrawal was not defeat, it was survival, a gesture of faith that time itself would correct the imbalance. Back in Napata, Taharka rebuilt. The temples there became sanctuaries of resistance filled with hymns and silent vows. Artisans carved his image larger than ever as though to defy erasure. On the walls of Kawa he is shown offering bread and wine to Amun, his posture serene, his crown unbroken. The message is clear: kingdoms may fall, but divine favor endures. Even the Assyrian tablets carved with their rulers' boasts acknowledge his persistence. The king of Kush fled to his homeland, they write, and there he reigns as before. For nearly 2 decades more, Taharka continued to rule from Nubia, maintaining Egypt's southern frontier, sending envoys, rebuilding cities. His enemies might have possessed the north, but they could not possess the Nile itself. The river's heart still beat in Kush. In that heartbeat lay the endurance of a people who had learned to survive empires by outlasting them. When death came to Taharka, it came not as tragedy but as release. He was buried near Nuri, beneath one of the great pyramids his own masons had raised, a structure smaller than those of Giza, yet steeped in a deeper silence. Around his tomb the desert hums softly even today, the air heavy with memory. The inscriptions on his chapel speak of renewal. He lives again in the light of the sun. He joins the company of the gods. It is both epitaph and prophecy. In the generations that followed, Kush would retreat fully from Egypt, its capital eventually shifting southward to Meroë. Yet the legacy of Taharka endured, in art, in architecture, and in the rhythm of the river itself. Even the Assyrians who claimed victory could not erase the grandeur of what they had touched. Their empires fell to dust, while the statues of Taharka still stand. Their gaze unwavering, their silence unbroken. Some historians call his reign the last flowering of the ancient world before iron and empire reshaped it forever. But perhaps it was more than that. In Taharka's long struggle, the builder turned warrior, the pharaoh turned exile, the story of Kush reached its human core. That greatness is not the absence of loss, but the grace to endure it. And so the Nile flows on, past Memphis, past Napata, carrying silt, memory, and rumor. The temples he raised still catch the first light of dawn. The desert still breathes his name, though softly like a secret the world once knew how to pronounce. When the banners of Taharka faded into dust, the wind over Napata changed again. The river still flowed patient and unbroken, but the echoes of empire were softer now, like footsteps receding into memory. Egypt was gone, taken by foreign kings and foreign gods. The pharaohs of Kush returned to the mountains that had birthed them, not as conquerors, but as keepers of remembrance. Defeat can be loud for a moment, then terribly quiet. In that quiet, Kush learned to listen once more. The priests of Amun continued their hymns beneath the cliffs of Gebel Barkal, their voices weaving through the same corridors of stone that had once heard the coronation of kings who ruled both lands. The great temple still smelled of incense and dust. The statues of the gods, chipped by time and invasion, stared through the candle smoke with patient eyes. To those who prayed there, loss was not ending, it was purification. The throne passed to Tutankhamun, Taharka's kinsman, who tried briefly to reclaim Egypt from the Assyrians. For a moment, victory seemed near. Thebes opened its gates to him, and the Nile once more carried the scent of southern banners. But the moment vanished as quickly as it came. The Assyrian armies returned, swift and merciless. Thebes burned, its temples were plundered. The smoke of that destruction drifted south for days, turning the Nubian sky the color of mourning. When Tutankhamun withdrew to Napata, he brought with him not prisoners or treasure, but silence, and the understanding that empire had finally ended. From that silence, a different kind of power began to grow. The kings of Kush no longer dreamed of the delta. Their eyes turned instead toward the deep valleys and savannas of their own homeland. What had once been a border province of the pharaohs now became the heart of a civilization reimagined. The fields around Napata flourished. Traders moved along the river, bringing incense from the Red Sea, gold from the desert, and grain from the floodplains. In the workshops of Kawa and Sanam, artisans carved images of lions, cattle, and queens. The faces on those stones looked less Egyptian now, rounder, softer, closer to the people who made them. Religion remained the axis of life. Amun still ruled, but his image changed, less the aloof deity of Thebes, more a father of the land, his ram horns curving like the hills of Nubia. Alongside him rose other gods, Apetamak, the lion of war and fertility, Isis and Osiris, absorbed yet transformed by local faith. Rituals became more intimate, the language of prayer shifting slowly from hieroglyph to a new script whose sounds we still struggle to hear. The kingdom was becoming itself. Archaeologists who walk those ruins today find traces of this turning inward. Temples were rebuilt not in the massive symmetry of Egypt, but in proportions suited to the landscape, smaller, closer to the earth. The pyramids that marked royal burials at Nuri and later at El Kuru multiplied, rising like a field of pointed memories along the desert's edge. Each pyramid was steeper than its northern ancestor, its chambers filled with amulets, pottery, and cattle bones. A dialogue with eternity spoken in a dialect of sand. Life along the Nile adjusted to quieter rhythms. Farmers sang to the floods as their ancestors had. Women traded dyed cloth and carnelian beads in market courtyards shaded by date palms. The queens, still called Kandaka, great woman, presided over ceremonies with authority undiminished by distance from Egypt. They poured libations at shrines, judged disputes, and commanded armies when needed. In their rule, the spirit of Kush found new expression, balanced between earth and sky, power and nurture. Trade connected the kingdom to worlds far beyond the horizon. Caravans moved west toward Chad and the savannas of Inner Africa, south toward lands rich in iron and ivory. The Kushites no longer looked north for validation. They looked outward and inward at once. The desert that had once separated them from Egypt now became a bridge to Central Africa, to Arabia, perhaps even to realms whose names are lost. Gold, ostrich feathers, ebony, and exotic animals flowed through Napata's ports. The wealth of silence began to accumulate, yet the memory of Egypt was never completely gone. In the temples of Napata, murals still showed pharaohs offering lotus flowers to gods who bore both Egyptian and Nubian crowns. The inscription spoke of Upper and Lower Egypt as if unity still existed somewhere beyond sight, perhaps in heaven if not on earth. The Kushites did not erase their past, they absorbed it, the way the river absorbs every tributary without losing itself. Time passed slowly in the valley of Napata. Generations of kings were buried beneath the red hills. Each tomb faced west, toward the land of the setting sun. The royal necropolis at Nuri grew vast, rows of pyramids casting shadows like sundials across the sand. In those shadows, the priests continued their duties, lighting lamps each evening so that the spirits of kings could find their way home. The scent of myrrh mingled with wind and memory. Still, change was coming, subtle at first like the shift of current before flood. The center of life was moving southward. The air near Napata grew drier, the surrounding hills less generous. Farther downriver, the plains near Meroë promised richer soil, timber, and trade routes toward the interior. Caravans paused there longer. Temples rose. Smiths discovered iron beneath the red earth. The pulse of civilization was relocating, though no one yet called it exile. It was migration by instinct, the movement of life following water and renewal. For now, Napata remained sacred. The kings still came here to be crowned in the presence of Amun before returning to rule from wherever the river carried them. Pilgrims still climbed the slopes of Gebel Barkal to leave offerings of bread and flowers. But beneath the rituals, a quiet transformation was taking place. The memory of conquest was fading into myth, and myth was becoming identity. The Silent Kingdom was no longer a reflection of Egypt. It was a world unto itself, African in face, voice, and soul. From defeat, Kush had learned something that victory could never teach: how to turn loss into continuity and silence into language. The desert listened, and the river carried whispers south, toward a name that would soon replace Napata in the chronicles of time. That name was Meroë. The river turned southward at Napata, twisting through rocky gorges before it opens again to the plains of Meroë. There the Nile becomes younger, restless, its banks thick with acacia and papyrus. In this place of red soil and heavy sky, Kush found its second heartbeat. The old capital had been a sanctuary of priests and memories. Meroë would become a forge of kings. The shift was gradual, like the movement of stars across a patient night. At first, Meroë was only a seasonal camp, a depot for caravans and herds. But as the climate around Napata grew harsher, rains favored the south, and traders began to linger where the land promised renewal. Timber was abundant, fuel for the furnaces that soon rose like new temples. Beneath the earth lay iron, dark, stubborn, and transformative. The age of stone and bronze gave way to a new element, and with it, a new rhythm of life. Archaeologists who sift the Meroitic soil find the evidence written not in words, but in ash. Black layers rich with slag and charcoal, the footprints of smiths and furnaces. They show that by the 8th century BCE, the people of Kush had mastered the craft of smelting iron long before many of their northern neighbors. The desert rang with the echo of hammers, the hiss of quenched metal. It was a different kind of prayer, the prayer of creation through fire. Iron changed everything. It turned plows sharper, spears stronger, and trade faster. The smiths of Meroë became a new priesthood, their forges glowing at dusk like the hearts of gods. They were revered not only as craftsmen but as keepers of transformation, the ones who drew life from earth and flame. From this reverence grew an economy both practical and sacred. Caravans carried ingots north to Egypt and east to the Red Sea, while ivory, gold, and slaves flowed back through the gates of Meroë. The city became a crossroad between worlds, Africa, Arabia, and the fading empires of the Mediterranean. The capital itself grew vast. Ancient travelers described it as a place of palaces, gardens, and wide streets lined with date palms. At its center rose temples to Amun and Apetamak, to Isis and to unknown local gods whose names were carved in a script that even today resists full translation. The people of Meroë wrote in the Meroitic language, the oldest written tongue of sub-Saharan Africa, composed of signs that dance between hieroglyphs and alphabet, half Egyptian in ancestry, wholly Kushite in soul. Though its meaning is still elusive, the pattern of the writing feels like music. Short, rhythmic, almost spoken in breath. Meroë's rulers kept the faith of their forebears, but they wore it differently. Kings and queens alike bore the regalia of Pharaoh, crowns of cobras and sun discs, scepters shaped like papyrus stalks, yet their faces on the temple walls are broader, their bodies fuller, their gestures more human. They are not distant deities but earthly monarchs steeped in divine grace. Around them the queens, the Kandaks, stand as equals. They do not hide behind their husbands. They raise their own standards, issue decrees, and command armies. In one relief, a Kandake offers wine to Amun while her consort stands beside her, smaller, deferential. Power in Kush had learned to speak in two voices, sometimes even one. It is from these queens that later legends would bloom. The Greeks and Romans who reached the frontiers of Kush centuries later spoke in awe of warrior women who ruled without fear, whose armies met foreign invaders at the edge of the desert and sent them home wounded in pride. To them, these women were exotic myth. To Kush, they were continuity, descendants of the priestesses and mothers who had always held half the kingdom's breath. Daily life in Meroë pulsed with new confidence. The markets bustled with traders from beyond the horizon, men from Axum bringing salt and cattle, merchants from the Red Sea carrying glass, perfume, and spice. Blacksmiths sang to the rhythm of their hammers. Weavers dyed linen in indigo vats. Children learned to carve clay amulets shaped like lions, crocodiles, and birds. The city's wealth was visible even in its silence, the measured order of its streets, the steady smoke of its furnaces rising into the sky. Religion, too, evolved. The ram-headed Amun remained supreme, but beside him rose Apetamak, the lion god of Meroë, fierce, fertile, and uniquely Nubian. His temple at Naka stands even today, carved with scenes of kings offering captives to a lion-faced deity seated upon a throne. Unlike the distant gods of Egypt, Apetamak looks outward, his face forward, his power personal. He embodies a faith born from earth rather than sky, a god who knows the taste of dust and iron. In this era, the Nile's silence deepened into music. Festivals honored both sun and river. Dancers moved in circles to the beat of drums and the low chant of horns. Time was measured not by dynasties but by floods and harvests. To live in Meroë was to exist between the pulse of the forge and the breath of the river, between creation and reflection. Yet prosperity like water invites envy. To the north, Egypt had fallen under Persian and then Greek dominion. The old world turned again, restless. Meroë watched from its distance, content in its wealth and solitude, but history has a way of reaching even those who no longer seek it. For now, though, peace endured. The kings ruled, the queens spoke, and the iron sang. When night falls over the ruins of Meroë today, the air still smells faintly of metal and myrrh. The pyramids there, hundreds of them, rise closer together than stars in a small constellation, each marking the tomb of a ruler whose name may never again be spoken. Their angles are sharp against the twilight. Their shadows form a language the desert still recites. The silence here is not absence, it is continuity, the hum of a civilization that has forgotten how to die. The kingdom of Kush had withdrawn from the world's noise, only to build one of its own. And in that quiet forge of Meroë, beneath the hammer of time, a new kind of empire took shape, one that ruled not through conquest, but through endurance. For the first time in 1,000 years, Kush was no longer anyone's shadow. It was light of its own making. The centuries that followed were kind to Meroë. The Nile still rose and fell like a breathing god, and the hills rang with the sound of iron being born from fire. The furnaces never slept. Day and night they exhaled their thin blue smoke into the desert sky. In those years, the kingdom was less a state than a rhythm, steady, cyclical, self-renewing. Generations passed as gently as the flood, and in their passing, Kush reached a perfection that needed no proclamation. From the royal city, the world stretched outward in every direction. Southward lay savannas full of cattle and gold. Westward, the caravan tracks reached toward the oases of the Sahara. Eastward, narrow roads led to the Red Sea, where ships from Arabia and India brought incense, pearls, and strange woods that smelled of rain. To the north, Egypt glimmered like a mirage under new masters, Persians first, then Greeks, then Romans. But their empires seemed very far away. Meroë, secure in its distance, became the silent pulse between continents. The people of Kush no longer thought of themselves as inheritors of Egypt. The old hieroglyphs had faded from memory. The Meroitic script, still undeciphered, spread across temple walls, pottery, and stele. It was a language of their own making, curved and rhythmic, written as if sung rather than carved. The words may be lost, but their shapes suggest a civilization at ease with itself, confident, self-contained, uninterested in translation. Their art changed, too. The formal rigidity of Egyptian reliefs gave way to livelier lines, hunters chasing giraffes, musicians playing curved harps, queens offering lotus blossoms to lion-headed gods. Color returned, ochre and red, deep black outlines, blues that caught the light like water. The pyramids of Meroë were smaller than those of Giza, but far more numerous, their faces steep and clean. Their chapels covered with carved suns, stars, and scenes of resurrection. In their quiet way, they declared that eternity could be intimate. Religion had shifted with the land. Amun remained, but he shared his throne with Apedemak, the lion god whose smile was both serene and terrible. His temple at Naka shows kings and queens standing before him with offerings of fruit and arrows. To his people, he was not just a deity of war. He was the strength that ripened crops, the heat that forged metal, the fertility of the living world itself. Here the sacred was not remote. It breathed in the desert wind, slept in the seed, and woke in the hammer's spark. The court at Meroë mirrored this blend of grace and power. Kings ruled, but so did queens. The Kandakas had become more than consorts. They were sovereigns in their own right. Inscriptions speak of them leading armies, negotiating treaties, commanding priests. Their images on temple walls show them immense and radiant, sometimes grasping prisoners by the hair. A symbol not of cruelty but of cosmic control. To foreign visitors, these scenes were bewildering. To Meroë, they were natural. Balance embodied the harmony of male and female, strength and mercy. Daily life followed the same equilibrium. Farmers tended sorghum and barley in fields darkened by silt. Herds moved slowly across the plains, bells chiming in the heat. Traders gathered in open courtyards to weigh gold dust on small bronze scales, while potters shaped vessels that gleamed like river stones. Children learned to carve tiny lions from wood. Musicians sang of the river's moods. It was a civilization that saw no division between work and worship. Every gesture, even the act of drawing water, echoed the old rhythm of creation. The wealth that flowed through Meroë was legendary. Greek and later Roman merchants who reached its border towns wrote of elephants, iron weapons, and women draped in linen finer than that of Alexandria. They spoke of streets wide enough for 3 chariots, of marketplaces filled with spices and ostrich feathers. Their descriptions were half wonder, half envy, testimony to a kingdom that seemed untouched by the turbulence of the north. Yet history, patient and exacting, always remembers its debts. The Mediterranean world was changing. Alexander's empire had burned out and divided. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, had become Greek in tongue but African in soil. To the far west, Rome was rising, its legions extending roads that eventually touched the Red Sea. Even the most distant kingdoms could no longer remain invisible. Caravans from Meroë brought gold and ivory to the Nile Delta, and in return came whispers of new powers across the sea. Powers that measured wealth not by silence but by conquest. Within Meroë itself, the signs of age began to show. The forests around the city, long used for charcoal, receded. The soil thinned under centuries of cultivation. The furnaces still burned, but they consumed more wood for less yield. The Nile's floods grew erratic, and the desert crept a little closer each year. None of this seemed urgent at first. Civilization seldom noticed decline while the rituals of prosperity still repeat. The temples still rang with hymns, the markets still shimmered with color, and the kings still built pyramids even as the earth beneath them began to tire. But perhaps the most subtle change was within the spirit. The memory of conquest, the long tension between silence and ambition, had faded. Meroë no longer looked north with curiosity or fear. Its peace had become almost absolute, a stillness so complete it bordered on indifference. When travelers from Alexandria or Rome arrived with stories of distant wars, the people listened politely, then returned to their work. The kingdom had turned inward, wrapped in its own perfection. At night, the city glowed with a deep, steady light. Fires burned in the forges, casting red halos on the desert wind. The sound of hammers carried far, mingling with the distant call of river birds. If a traveler stood then on the ridge above the pyramids and looked north, he would have seen only darkness and stars, and perhaps thought that this was eternity itself, a civilization at rest beneath an indifferent sky. But the stars move, even when they seem still. Beyond the horizon, Rome's shadow lengthened. In Egypt, new governors began to count the wealth that flowed from the south. They looked toward Meroë not with awe, but with appetite. The peace of the Silent Kingdom, so long unbroken, would not last forever. The river that had carried its people from exile to glory was preparing once again to test the strength of their silence. The silence of Meroë had lasted for centuries, but silence cannot shield forever. When Egypt fell once more, this time to the armies of Rome, the Nile became a border between two empires that had never seen each other. To the north stood Augustus, master of the Mediterranean world. To the south, beyond the cataracts and the dunes, the old kingdom of Kush still breathed serene and unbowed. Between them lay the river, ancient witness to both ambition and forgetting. The Romans called the people beyond the first cataract Aethiopes, the burnt-faced ones, as though the color of their skin explained the heat of the land itself. They knew little of the cities that lay beyond the desert wind. To them the south was a direction, not a civilization. Yet in Meroë, the queen who ruled did not need Rome to define her. Her name was Amanirenas, and she bore the title of Kandake, great woman, mother and sovereign of the two lands of Kush. By the time Augustus crowned himself emperor in 27 BCE, Meroë had grown into a labyrinth of temples, palaces, and forges. Its people traded with Arabia and India, and its rulers minted coins stamped with lions and crescent moons. Wealth shimmered in every courtyard, and yet the kingdom kept to itself. It asked nothing from the north except to be left alone. Rome, of course, could not understand that kind of power. Empires rarely do. At first there was peace. Augustus installed a governor in Egypt named Cornelius Gallus, whose soldiers patrolled the Nile as far south as the first cataract. They taxed the trade that moved north, gold and ivory and slaves. To the Romans it was routine administration. To the Kushites it was intrusion. When Gallus's successor Petronius pushed farther and demanded tribute, the silence of Meroë broke like iron under strain. Amanirenas did not send diplomats, she sent armies. Roman chroniclers writing decades later admit their surprise. They describe Nubian archers advancing through the desert, their bows taller than a man, their arrows tipped with iron and bone. They came swiftly, striking Aswan and Elephantine before the legions could form. They burned the Roman garrisons, toppled statues, and carried away the bronze likeness of Augustus himself. Dragged south through the sand and buried beneath the steps of a temple, a trophy offered to Amun. Even today, archaeologists have found fragments of that head at Meroë, the emperor's calm face staring forever toward the ground. The counterattack was inevitable. Petronius, gathering 3 legions, marched south in the heat of 24 BCE. The Romans were professional, disciplined, and merciless. They retook Aswan, advanced to Napata, and burned it to the ground. Temples cracked, and the statues of gods fell among their priests. Amanirenas retreated, her army shattered but not broken. Rome called it victory, but in truth it was exhaustion, a conquest that reached no further than the edge of the desert. The legions could not hold what they had taken. The Nile itself resisted them. In the scorching months that followed, both sides simply waited, the river between them shimmering with heat and unfinished war. Then came a pause, a human decision that turned defeat into endurance. Amanirenas sent envoys north under a white banner. The Roman governor expected submission. Instead, he found negotiation. The queen, blinded in one eye from battle, demanded peace on equal terms. No tribute, no occupation, only respect between sovereigns. The diplomats hesitated, then relented. The treaty that followed, signed around 21 BCE, marked one of the few times Rome agreed to withdraw from a conquered land without condition. The border was set at the first cataract, and the silence returned intact but stronger for having been broken. In the centuries that followed, Roman writers would half forget the event. Strabo mentioned the treaty briefly, calling the queen a masculine woman, blind in one eye. Others turned her into legend, but in Meroë, her memory endured in stone. Reliefs show Amanirenas and her successor Amani-Sha-Keto standing before Apetamak, the lion god, offering prisoners as symbols of conquered pride. Their crowns are high, their arms firm. They do not smile, yet there is peace in their stillness. The peace of those who have faced the world and found it mortal. The trade routes reopened. Roman merchants returned to buy gold and ivory, to marvel at the iron weapons and the red cloth woven by Meroitic hands. Inscriptions from both sides record gifts, not demands. The old rhythm resumed, this time tuned to a quieter strength. The kingdom of Kush, written off by outsiders as remote and primitive, had outwitted the greatest empire of its age through endurance alone. The pyramids multiplied along the desert's rim. Each new king and queen raised one higher, their chapels decorated with scenes of triumph not over others but over time. The Meroitic script flourished, curling like reeds in the wind. Music and laughter returned to the markets, and in the evenings the smiths' fires burned as they had for centuries. Life, stubborn and beautiful, continued, but even victories fade. The treaty with Rome held for 300 years, yet nothing in the desert endures unchanged. The forests around Meroë thinned further. The iron furnaces demanded more wood than the land could offer. To the east, new powers rose along the Ethiopian highlands, kingdoms whose caravans rivaled those of Kush. To the west, the desert swallowed the old caravan routes. Slowly, the balance that had sustained the Silent Kingdom began to tilt. Still, Amanirenas' shadow lingered over the land. The people told stories of the one-eyed queen who defied the emperor of the world. Children carved lions in her honor. The priests said that Apetamak himself had chosen her, that her wound was a mark of divine sight. In the long evenings when the wind moved through the empty courtyards of Meroë, one could almost hear her voice, a whisper carried by iron and sand. We do not bow. We wait. And the kingdom did wait, century after century, watching as empires rose and fell around it. Rome itself would crumble. Its emperors would turn to dust. But in the heart of Sudan, the pyramids of Meroë would remain, their edges sharp against the wind, the silence around them still heavier than conquest. The smoke of the forges rose for generations after Amanirenas was gone. In the evening light, it drifted like prayer above the desert, thin and red. The clang of iron still echoed through the streets of Meroë, and the river still flowed with its calm authority as though nothing had changed. But beneath that rhythm, time had already begun its patient work. Decline does not announce itself. It begins in small absences, the missing song of birds in the morning, the slow retreat of green from the hills, the furnace that needs more wood than before to make the same flame. Around the 2nd century CE, these absences multiplied. The forests near Meroë, once thick with acacia and sycamore, were stripped bare for charcoal. The land grew thin and tired. The furnaces, once the heartbeat of the city, became both its glory and its burden. The air filled with ash. The soil turned gray. Each ingot of iron was a triumph pulled from the ribs of an exhausted earth. Trade, too, began to turn elsewhere. To the east, across the Red Sea, the kingdom of Axum was rising, its ships sailing to India and Arabia. Gold, ivory, and incense that once flowed through Kush now passed through Axum's harbors. To the north, Rome's appetite had dulled. The empire was turning inward, its borders bleeding from too many wars. The caravans that once shimmered on the horizon grew fewer, their bells quieter. The silence that had once been strength began to feel heavy, like a weight that no longer carried meaning. And yet Meroë endured. Civilizations that live long learned to live slowly. The temples still stood, the pyramids still multiplied, each ruler leaving behind a monument to eternity even as eternity grew more distant. The queens still ruled beside the kings, their names carved in the elegant curves of the Meroitic script. Amanitore, Amanikatashan, Amanishaketo, each syllable like a note in the last song of an ancient choir. Their crowns gleamed, their statues stood proud, their rituals continued. Outwardly the kingdom was unchanged. Inwardly it was turning to memory. Archaeologists walking through Meroë's ruins can still see the layers of this slow fading. Beneath the sand lie neighborhoods rebuilt again and again, houses made smaller each time, as if life itself was learning to withdraw with grace. The temple walls showed the same gods, Amun, Apedamak, Isis, but their faces softened, their inscriptions fewer, the spaces between them filled with symbols whose meanings no one can yet read. The script, once the signature of sovereignty, became an enigma even to those who wrote it. The priests recited words that had become pure sound. Still the people lived. They farmed where the river allowed, traded where paths still crossed, and buried their dead with the same quiet dignity as their ancestors. In the markets, pottery remained painted with bright ochres and reds, decorated with spirals that seemed to imitate the river's flow. Children played beside the pyramids, their laughter chasing echoes through chambers meant for kings. The living and the dead had long ago learned to share the same air. Beyond the city, however, new forces gathered. The Axumites, strong and ambitious, began to look westward. Their inscriptions speak of campaigns along the Nile, of tribute demanded from peoples whose names are half forgotten. Whether Meroë was among them is uncertain, but the shadows of conflict lengthened. The balance that had once kept the Silent Kingdom untouched was tilting toward an ending not of destruction, but of displacement. Sometime in the 3rd or 4th century CE, the iron furnaces went cold. The forges that had sung for 800 years fell silent one by one, leaving behind black mounds of slag that still scar the desert today. Without their heat, Meroë cooled, and with that cooling came stillness. The artisans left first, then the merchants, then the priests. The last kings ruled over a city more ghost than capital. The pyramids continued to rise, but fewer each generation until even they stopped. The desert reclaimed the streets, the temples, the courtyards where the queens once sat in judgment. No chronicler recorded the final days. No foreign army wrote of conquest, no poet of mourning. Meroë did not fall. It drifted away like a sand dune dissolving back into the wind. The people moved south and east, following the river to new lands. Some settled near the Atbara. Others joined tribes whose descendants still live in Sudan today. The name Kush faded, replaced by others, Alwa, Makuria, Nobatia, new kingdoms born from the old silence. Centuries later, travelers from the north would find the ruins half buried, their pyramids jagged against the dawn. They would marvel at the perfection of the stone, the unreadable inscriptions, the sense of presence that lingered in the air. To them, this place was a riddle, a forgotten chapter of a book that history had closed too soon. They would not know that for the people who once lived there, silence was not oblivion but completion. For even as the furnaces died, something remained. The rhythm of the Nile never stopped. Its flood still nourished fields far downstream. The myths of Amun and Apetamak merged into local tales of saints and spirits. The pyramids became markers of memory in a landscape that refused to forget. And deep beneath the sand, in chambers untouched for 2,000 years, lay the bones of kings and queens who had ruled by the river's grace, their faces turned west toward the setting sun. When the desert wind passes over those tombs today, it carries the same sound that the first settlers of Kush must have heard thousands of years before. A low, unending hum, neither song nor silence, but something between. It is the voice of continuity itself, reminding all who listen that nothing in time truly ends. It only changes its form. Thus the kingdom of Kush faded, not with fire but with breath, a civilization that learned how to die as it had lived, slowly, beautifully, and without noise. The city was gone, but the river remembered. Long after the last fires of Meroë sank to ash, the Nile kept the rhythm of the kingdom alive. Each year the water rose, breathing through the same valleys, washing over the same sand. And in that patient pulse, fragments of the old civilization took root again. Smaller, quieter, but still luminous beneath the dust. For centuries, travelers who followed the river south from Egypt spoke of scattered towns where the people still built their houses of brick and clay, still carved small pyramids beside their graves, still painted ram-headed gods on walls worn by wind. They called these people Nubians, though the word was not their own. The Nubians were the heirs of Kush, living among its ruins, carrying its gestures and rhythms as naturally as breath. Empires had come and gone, yet the pulse endured. The language of Meroë had faded, but its melody survived in new tongues. The people spoke dialects descended from the same riverbed of sound, soft and vowel-rich, full of open syllables and slow cadence. When foreign merchants came from the north, they noted that even in villages built on Christian foundations, the names of kings and gods echoed with the music of the old world. The priests of the new faith prayed in Greek and Coptic, but they sang in Nubian, the same gentle vowels that once invoked Amun and Apetamak, now carrying the names of saints. By the 6th century of our era, new kingdoms had risen where Kush had once ruled. Nobatia in the north, Makuria in the Middle Valley and Alwa in the fertile south formed a triad of realms bound not by empire but by faith. Christianity had reached the Nile from Alexandria, carried by monks who traveled barefoot across the desert, their crosses glinting under the same sun that had once gilded the crowns of pharaohs. They found in Nubia a people already familiar with the idea of divine kingship, of eternity carved in stone, of light as the body of God. The transition from temple to church was gentle, less a conversion than a translation. The first cathedrals rose upon older foundations. At Faras, painters covered walls with frescoes of angels whose wings spread in patterns that once belonged to lotus petals. The faces of saints were dark, their eyes elongated like the statues of Meroë. In their gestures one could still see the echo of royal art, the calm frontality, the hands raised in offering. Scholars who study those frescoes today call them Christian, yet their silence belongs to an older faith. Beneath every layer of plaster, Kush still breathes. The new kings ruled from Dongola and Soba, their courts vibrant with song and ceremony. Chronicles written by Arab travelers speak of cities filled with gardens and libraries, of rulers who read both scripture and the stars. They called the king of Makuria the protector of the cross, but his coronation still followed the pattern of the ancient Nile. He was anointed with oil, crowned beneath a canopy, and presented to the people in a ritual that owed as much to Amun as to Christ. Even the royal titles carried the cadence of Kush, the words for majesty and peace preserved like fossils in a new grammar. Along the riverbanks, the people continued to live much as their ancestors had. They farmed sorghum and barley, raised cattle, shaped pottery in the same red and black pattern first seen at Kerma 2,000 years before. The women still wore amulets against the evil eye, carved not with crosses but with spirals and suns. The dead were buried facing west, toward the land of setting light. Time had changed the prayers, not the instinct behind them. Trade returned slowly, weaving these Nubian kingdoms into the wider world. Caravans from the Red Sea brought silk and incense. Arab merchants sailed up the Nile with salt and dates. There was conflict, too. Raids and skirmishes along the frontier, but for centuries peace held. The kingdoms of Nubia stood as a bridge between Africa and the Mediterranean, guardians of a memory neither Christian nor pagan, but both. In those quiet centuries, the meaning of silence changed once again. For the ancients of Kush, silence had been sacred space, the pause between heartbeat and breath. For the Christians of Nubia, silence became prayer, the listening for a voice within. Yet the feeling was the same. In both, the river was a metaphor for faith, unseen at its source, endless at its mouth, carrying life through deserts that otherwise would not forgive. By the 12th century, even these kingdoms began to fade. The sands thickened around the old cities. The water shifted course. Arab migrations brought new tongues, new faiths. Churches fell into ruin beside temples already ancient, and villages built their walls from stones once carved with angels and gods alike. The line between the sacred and the ordinary blurred until only the river itself remained to remember. Yet the legacy of Kush never vanished. It endured in gestures, in songs, in the way the people of the Nile still pause to greet the morning sun. It lived in the memory of strong queens, in stories told by firelight of rulers who commanded without cruelty. Even the music of the region, with its long descending scales and repeating rhythms, seems to echo the movement of the ancient forge. The sound of hammer and heartbeat intertwined. When modern explorers arrived in the 19th century following maps drawn from rumor, they found pyramids half buried but still perfect. Inside them, colors survived the centuries. Reds, blues, and ochres bright as if painted yesterday. The walls spoke of kings and queens who had lived when Rome was young. The archaeologists brushed away sand and called it discovery, but the land itself had never forgotten. The silence they broke was not absence. It was patience. Today in Sudan, the people who live along that stretch of the Nile still call the river Bahr al-Abyad, the White Sea. They speak Arabic, yet their words carry a rhythm older than Arabic, older even than hieroglyphs. In their faces, scholars see the same calm symmetry as in the statues of Meroë. The kingdom may be gone, but its image endures in flesh and language, in the way the sun sets on the water like polished copper, in the way stories linger when stone fails. The Silent Kingdom had learned long ago that time is not an enemy. It is the river itself. And as the river moves, it carries everything forward, the pyramids, the prayers, the silence, into new forms never truly lost. For 1,000 years, the pyramids of Kush slept beneath the sand, their edges blurred, their names unspoken. The desert, patient as always, guarded them in silence. No one who lived nearby thought them strange. They were simply part of the landscape. Old stones, older stories, shadows in the heat. But in the eyes of those who came from far away, they were a revelation. The 19th century was an age of discovery disguised as conquest. Europe, restless after centuries of its own wars, turned its gaze outward. Travelers, soldiers, and scholars followed the Nile north to its source and south to its mysteries. Among them were men with notebooks and compasses, carrying the arrogance of empires that believed the world began with them. When they reached the deserts of northern Sudan, they found a sight that made even their certainty tremble. There, scattered like constellations fallen to earth, stood the pyramids of Meroë. Dozens of them, steep and sharp, rising from sand so red it seemed to burn at dusk. Some still had their capstones, others were broken, their upper tiers blasted away by wind or time. They were smaller than Egypt's, yet far more numerous, their walls carved with unfamiliar gods and elegant hieroglyphs that did not quite belong to Egypt. For the explorers, it was as if history itself had whispered a correction. Civilization had not ended at the cataracts. The first to record them was Frédéric Caillot, a Frenchman who visited in 1821 while accompanying the Egyptian army of Muhammad Ali during its southern campaign. He walked among the ruins, sketching each pyramid by hand, his lines careful, almost reverent. "The silence here," he wrote, "is not death but majesty." Others followed, Giuseppe Ferlini, an Italian treasure hunter who in 1834 blew the tops off several pyramids searching for gold. He found it, hidden in the tomb of Queen Amenishaketo. Jewelry so intricate it rivaled anything from Rome. Yet his greed destroyed what centuries had preserved. The desert swallowed his footprints, but not his damage. Archaeology was young then, and curiosity often walked hand in hand with plunder. Museums in Berlin, Munich, and London filled their halls with artifacts labeled Nubian, their origins noted vaguely, their meanings barely understood. To the scholars of the time, Africa south of Egypt was a margin, a place of imitation rather than invention. The idea that a black civilization had built its own pyramids, its own script, its own science of iron, was too inconvenient for the story Europe wanted to tell itself. But the stones refused to be silent. In the early 20th century, new expeditions arrived, guided less by treasure and more by wonder. George Andrew Reisner, an American archaeologist working under Harvard University and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, excavated Napata and Meroë between 1916 and 1923. He cataloged royal tombs, studied pottery, traced dynasties. His methods were careful, his interpretations less so. To him, the grandeur of Kush could only be explained as the shadow of Egypt. Nubia, he wrote, is the child of the north. It would take another century for that assumption to fade. In the decades that followed, African scholars and Sudanese archaeologists began to take up the story themselves. They read the same stones through different eyes. Where Reisner saw imitation, they saw dialogue. Where Europeans spoke of decline, they spoke of endurance. The silence of Kush, they argued, was not ignorance, it was choice. The civilization had spoken in its own language, one that outsiders had not yet learned to hear. The Meroitic script became a symbol of that mystery. Discovered carved on stele and temple walls, it stood between two worlds, half familiar, half unknown. Linguists have deciphered its alphabet, but not its meaning. The grammar remains elusive, as if the language still guards its secrets. Even today, researchers pore over those signs, searching for the key that will let the ancient voices speak again. Perhaps it is fitting that they do not yet yield. Every silence deserves its own dignity. By the mid-20th century, as Sudan moved toward independence, the pyramids of Kush began to appear in a new light, not as relics of obscurity, but as emblems of identity. The newly independent nation adopted the memory of Kush as proof that Africa had been a cradle of civilization in its own right. Schools taught the story of the Black Pharaohs, the kings of Napata and Meroë who had ruled Egypt and defied Rome. In their quiet pride, people found continuity, a lineage that reached back 3,000 years and beyond any empire's shadow. Modern archaeologists, Sudanese and international alike, continue to work among those ruins, often in solitude. At dawn, they stand on the dunes watching sunlight spill across the pyramids. The desert changes color from gray to rose to gold. It is easy in that hour to imagine the city alive again. The clang of iron, the smell of myrrh, the chants of priests echoing through the corridors of stone. The wind carries fragments of that world as if the past has learned to breathe again through its own dust. In museums, the objects of Kush are slowly being returned. Figurines of gods, jewelry of queens, stele inscribed with the shapes of a forgotten language. Each carries a fragment of memory home. And in Sudan itself, artists and poets have taken up the story, weaving it into songs, murals, and verse. They call Meroë the city of silence, but the silence is no longer empty. It hums with rediscovery. History, like the Nile, bends and returns. The same river that once carried Kush's armies and merchants now carries tourists and scholars, pilgrims of curiosity. They stand before the pyramids at dusk, the air cooling, the sky turning violet. In that stillness they realize that these ruins are not remnants. They are sentences paused mid-breath, waiting for the world to listen again. And the world has begun to listen. The Silent Kingdom, once dismissed as an echo, has become a voice. It speaks now in languages new and old, in the pride of nations and the hum of history rewritten. Its story, like the desert wind, moves without hurry, carrying both loss and awakening in equal measure. The pyramids of Meroë still watch the horizon. Their shadows lengthen with evening, pointing not toward what was lost but toward what endures. The unbroken continuity of a people who, even in silence, never cease to exist. Some civilizations leave behind empires, others leave behind ways of seeing. When the last embers of Meroë cooled, what remained was not power but a philosophy, a rhythm of thought that still moves beneath the surface of African consciousness like an underground river. To study Kush is to listen for that current, to hear how silence became a form of knowledge, how time itself was understood not as a line but as a circle, forever returning to its source. The priests of Napata once taught that all things were born from the breath of Amun, the hidden god whose name meant the unseen one. They said that silence was the state of creation before sound, that the word, when spoken, merely revealed what silence already knew. This belief shaped every temple, every ritual, every life. Even today, when you walk among the ruins of Gebel Barkal or Meroë, you can feel that pause in the air, the space between thought and expression. It is the architecture of listening. Across Africa, echoes of that idea survived long after the temples fell. In the oral traditions of the Sahel and the savannas, silence remains sacred. The griots of Mali begin their songs with a moment of quiet, acknowledging that words draw their power from what they disturb. Among the peoples of the Nile Valley, pauses in conversation are not absence but respect, a way of allowing truth to form before it is spoken. The old kingdom may have vanished, but its language of restraint endured. Kush's vision of time also persisted. For the people of the Nile, history was not a ladder rising toward progress, but a wheel turning through renewal. The flood of the river, the waxing of the moon, the rise and fall of dynasties, all were versions of the same motion. To live wisely was not to escape the circle, but to move within it gracefully. The Christian Nubian kingdoms that followed inherited this pattern. Their liturgies were tied to the seasons, their architecture to the sun's arc, their faith to the rhythm of light and shadow. Even in the modern world, where clocks measure every second, the river's cycle continues, eternal, indifferent, perfect. From that cyclical sense of existence came Kush's distinctive calm in the face of decline. Where other empires saw defeat, Kush saw transformation. The retreat from Egypt, the shift to Meroë, even the final fading of the furnaces, each was a phase, not an ending. The same belief pulses in many African philosophies today, that nothing dies, it only changes its form, that ancestry is not behind us but within us, speaking through the living. The pyramids of Nubia stand as metaphors for this truth, sharp points reaching upward, but their bases sunk deep in the continuity of the earth. The balance between male and female, too, was part of that inheritance. The queens of Kush were not anomalies, but embodiments of a worldview in which creation required dual harmony. The Kandake was not a consort to the king, but his complement, the visible half of divine order. That vision of shared authority survived in subtler ways, in the matrilineal traditions of Sudanese clans, in the respect given to mothers and sisters in local law, in the recurring figure of the wise queen in African folklore. Power for Kush was never singular. It was relational, a conversation between strength and nurture, voice and echo. Even the theology of Apedemak, the lion god of Meroë, speaks to something larger. He was not merely a war deity, but the union of ferocity and fertility, the fierce protection of life itself. His temples show him receiving offerings of fruit and flowers beside prisoners and spears, a vision of violence held in equilibrium with generosity. In many African cosmologies, the same duality endures: thunder gods who bring both storm and harvest, ancestors who bless and discipline in equal measure. It is an ethics of balance born from the desert's precision. Modern philosophers of Africa often describe this legacy as vital harmony, a worldview where existence is an unbroken continuum, every element connected through reciprocal energy. In that sense, Kush was one of the earliest civilizations to articulate an ecological consciousness. Its architecture mirrored the landscape, its rituals honored the river, its kingship served as mediation between nature and divinity. The line between spiritual and material did not exist. Both were currents of the same water. When European thought rediscovered Kush in the 19th and 20th centuries, it did so through the lens of archaeology, not philosophy. Stones were measured, dynasties listed, artifacts displayed behind glass. Yet what was hardest to measure was what Kush understood best: the invisible geometry of meaning. A civilization that could disappear without dying, that could surrender empire and still command reverence, that could hold silence as its highest art. Such a civilization defied the categories of conquest and progress. It belonged to a deeper rhythm of being. Today, African writers and thinkers return to Kush not simply as heritage, but as perspective. They see in its story a template for endurance without domination, for beauty born of restraint, for renewal through remembering. The Black Pharaohs, once treated as historical footnotes, have become symbols of sovereignty reclaimed. The pyramids of Sudan, once misread as imitations, now stand as testaments to independent genius. In their quiet symmetry, they remind a restless world that continuity can be more powerful than conquest. At night, under the same constellations that watched over Meroë, the desert still hums with that old philosophy. The wind moving across stone sounds almost like breathing. The stars trace their slow circles. Somewhere in that rhythm, the silence of Kush persists, not as absence but as understanding. It whispers a truth both ancient and immediate: that strength need not shout, that time is not a thief, that even when forgotten meaning waits, patient as the Nile, for those willing to listen. There are moments in history when the buried rise, not from the ground, but from memory. Kush had slept for 2,000 years, its cities forgotten beneath sand and time. But in the 20th century, as Africa and its diaspora began to reclaim the stories stolen from them, the Silent Kingdom stirred again. Not through archaeology this time, but through imagination. For generations, colonial schools had taught that civilization came from the north, that Africa had received rather than given. Maps showed the Nile flowing downward as if ideas could only travel with the current. But as independence movements swept across the continent, as poets and leaders searched for roots deeper than empire, the names of Nubia, Napata, and Meroë began to surface again like stones after flood. They offered proof that Africa's genius had never needed permission. In the 1930s, the Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop began to write of Egypt and Kush as African in origin and spirit. His arguments, controversial at the time, challenged the old hierarchies of race and history. To study Kush, he wrote, is to study ourselves before division. For Diop and those who followed him, the Black Pharaohs were not curiosities. They were ancestors, evidence that Africa's past was not darkness but dawn. His words moved from universities to movements, from lecture halls to liberation speeches. The civil rights era in America heard the same call. Black artists and thinkers looked to Kush as symbol and mirror. In Harlem, murals depicted Nubian queens wearing the crowns of ancient Kush. In jazz clubs, songs were named for the Nile and the desert wind. The poet Margaret Walker wrote of Ethiopia rising, while Langston Hughes dreamed of rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood. Their verses reached back to the Nile, where silence and power had once been one. The pyramids of Meroë, distant yet familiar, became metaphors for endurance, black stone defying the bleaching sun. As the 1960s unfolded, independence spread across Africa like sunrise. Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, each nation sought a story to stand upon. The rediscovery of Kush offered something deeper than nationalism, a shared heritage of wisdom and resilience. In Sudan, school children learned that their land had once ruled the pharaohs. Their textbooks spoke of Amanarinas, the queen who defied Rome, and Taharka, the pharaoh who built temples from Thebes to Napata. To a generation emerging from colonial rule, these were not just historical figures. They were confirmations of worth. The idea of Kush crossed borders and disciplines. Painters reimagined its gods in modern colors. Sculptors carved new lions for Apedemak. The Sudanese artist Ibrahim el-Salahi spoke of painting the spirit of Meroë, lines and patterns that seemed to echo the curves of the old script. In music, drums and chants reclaimed the rhythm of the Nile, that slow, patient heartbeat that had once governed both flood and faith. Across the diaspora, the image of the Kandake, the warrior queen, became a figure of feminine power, her crown of feathers reappearing in literature, fashion, and film. Meanwhile, scholars returned to the deserts with new questions. Excavations led by Sudanese archaeologists uncovered temples, stelae, and inscriptions long ignored by Western institutions. Each discovery challenged an older narrative. The story of Kush was no longer a footnote to Egypt, but a chapter of its own, a center rather than a margin. The term Nubia began to be used not as a label of distance but of pride. In 1974, at a UNESCO conference in Cairo, African historians gathered to rewrite the continent's early history from its own perspective. Kush stood at the center of that effort, a civilization that proved the unity of African antiquity. Delegates spoke of its script, its metallurgy, its queens, its diplomacy with Rome. If Egypt is the memory of Africa, one scholar said, then Kush is its conscience. The words hung in the air like an invocation. Through the latter 20th century, the idea of Kush spread quietly through culture. It appeared in Pan-African literature, in the sermons of liberation theologians, In the curricula of universities from Khartoum to Atlanta, the pyramids of Meroë became symbols not of mystery but of belonging. Even the modern political language of Sudan carried traces of it. Names of towns, rivers, and tribes whispering old syllables through new mouths. The silence of the kingdom had become a vocabulary of pride. But history, when reclaimed, also becomes mirror. As African nations struggled with their own divisions, the memory of Kush offered both comfort and warning. It reminded them that civilizations could fall not only to invaders, but to the slow erosion of balance. In speeches and essays, the story of Meroë became allegory. That strength lies in listening, that renewal comes from within. The ancient theology of Ma'at, the harmony of all things, was invoked again, now as a principle of social justice. To stand before the pyramids today is to feel that dialogue between past and present. Tourists come with cameras, scholars with notebooks, locals with quiet reverence. The air hums with a serenity that no conquest ever learned to understand. It is easy to forget that these monuments were built by hands darker than the sand around them, that their makers spoke languages no one has yet deciphered, that their silence is not emptiness but choice. Each block of stone seems to say, "We are still here," and indeed they are. The pyramids of Meroë have survived wars, colonial borders, and centuries of indifference. They stand not as ruins but as witnesses, watching as the world once again begins to see them. Around them the desert stretches like an ocean of time, and the wind carries voices both ancient and newly awakened. Kush lives now not only in history books but in art, in memory, in the quiet insistence of those who refuse to let silence mean absence. In every child who learns that Africa once ruled itself, in every poem that names the Nile as home, the kingdom breathes again. And the breath is calm, because the lesson of Kush has always been the same, that silence when chosen is not the end of speech, it is the beginning of wisdom. Morning comes slowly to the desert. The light drifts over the dunes like a tide, turning gold to white, shadow to warmth. And when it reaches the pyramids of Meroë, it finds them waiting, each one a fragment of geometry drawn against eternity. Around them there is almost no sound, only the soft shuffle of wind, the distant murmur of a camel, and the faint echo of history breathing through stone. In this silence, Sudan wakes. Modern Sudan is a country of contradictions, ancient and young, wounded and resilient. Its borders are colonial inventions. Its heart, however, is far older. Beneath its soil lies the memory of kingdoms that ruled before the word Africa had meaning to the world beyond. Here the Nile still winds through the desert like a silver thought, threading together what time tried to divide. Along its banks stand reminders of the Silent Kingdom. Pyramids, temples, necropolises, each whispering fragments of a story the nation is still learning to read aloud. Archaeologists return to these sites year after year. They work quietly under the same sun that once gilded the crowns of Taharqa and Amanirenas. Their tents cluster at the edge of the dunes, their notebooks fill with sketches and stratigraphic lines. The work is slow, patient, almost reverential. Each layer of sand removed reveals another page of a forgotten manuscript, pottery shards, stone altars, fragments of inscriptions. Sometimes the discoveries are small, a bead, a cup, a child's footprint hardened in clay. Yet each fragment, when brushed clean, seems to vibrate with recognition. The past is not gone. It was simply waiting. Many of these teams are Sudanese, trained in universities that stand in Khartoum or at the very edge of the desert. Their approach differs from the earlier expeditions of Europe. They do not come as conquerors or collectors. They come as listeners. To them, these ruins are not foreign puzzles but ancestral whispers, proof that the land's silence has always been full of meaning. "We are not discovering Kush," one archaeologist said in an interview standing beneath the shadow of a pyramid. "We are remembering it." Around Meroë, preservation has become both devotion and struggle. The sand, which once protected the pyramids, now threatens to consume them. Each storm buries a little more, erases a line, smooths an edge. The climate grows harsher, the Nile's rhythm more unpredictable. Funds are scarce, politics unstable, yet even amid turmoil, small miracles happen. In 2011, local communities joined with archaeologists to restore several temples. School children helped clear debris, learning as they worked. They sang while they dug, songs about lions and river gods, as if the old hymns had merely changed their words. Tourists come too, though fewer than the monuments deserve. Those who make the journey often speak of the strange calm that surrounds the site. The pyramids are smaller than Giza's, but more intimate. One can stand beside them, touch the stone, feel the temperature of centuries. At sunset, their shadows stretch toward the horizon, intersecting like the arms of an invisible compass. The desert cools, and the air smells faintly of metal and myrrh. In that moment, time feels porous. The line between ancient and present dissolves. In Khartoum's museums, the artifacts of Kush are displayed with quiet pride. Gold jewelry, stele inscribed with the Meroitic script. Statues of kings and queens whose features mirror those of the people who now gaze upon them. For visitors, these exhibits are history. For Sudanese families, they are inheritance. School children press their palms against the glass, tracing the faces of Amanirenas and Taharka with their eyes. Teachers speak softly of the days when Sudan ruled the Nile. The children listen, wide-eyed, as if hearing a secret too large for words. Beyond the museums, the story continues in less visible ways. Writers, musicians, and filmmakers draw upon the imagery of Kush to reimagine identity. In poems, the pyramids become metaphors for endurance. In songs, the Nile becomes the voice of ancestors. In murals across Omdurman and Atbara, the Kandake appears as guardian of a nation still learning to stand whole. The idea of Kush has returned not as nostalgia but as blueprint, a reminder that silence is not weakness, that dignity can outlast empire. Yet the work of preservation remains fragile. Conflict and neglect often threaten what time is spared. Looters still wander the desert, hoping for the gold that once drove European plunderers. The government, burdened by crisis, struggles to protect sites that stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Scholars warn that without sustained care, the Silent Kingdom may again vanish beneath the dunes. But there is also faith. In the persistence of stone, in the patience of the Nile, in the will of those who belong to both. At night, when the archaeologists leave their lamps burning in their tents, the pyramids seem to glow from within. The air cools, the stars unfold, and the ruins appear almost alive. Each pyramid a silent musician in a desert orchestra tuned to eternity. The wind moves softly through their doorways as if the past were exhaling. In that hush, one can almost hear the words that no scholar has yet translated. Perhaps they say nothing. Perhaps they say everything. The modern Sudanese poet Mahjoub Sharif once wrote, "The land remembers what the tongue forgets." Standing in Meroë, the truth of that line feels infinite. The land does remember. The footsteps, the prayers, the silence. And through those who listen, it speaks again. The Silent Kingdom, once lost and rediscovered, now stands as both monument and mirror. Its ruins remind the living that identity is not invention but inheritance. That history is not a chain of conquests, but a river of continuities. Beneath the same stars that watched Pillé and Amanirena's, new generations walk the dunes and call this place home. The silence endures, but it is no longer lonely. Every civilization leaves behind a sound. Some end in the clash of empires, others in the hum of machines or the fading murmur of prayer. Kush ended differently. It ended in quiet. Not in defeat, but in understanding. And perhaps that is why it still speaks. To stand among the pyramids of Meroë is to stand inside that quiet. The sand softens every echo, the horizon absorbs every breath. There is no noise of conquest here, no drumbeat of ambition, only the long exhalation of a world that learned how to end without disappearing. In that stillness, something universal begins to stir, a recognition that what Kush understood about time and silence belongs not only to Africa but to us all. Every empire that has risen since, Rome, Byzantium, the caliphates, the kingdoms of Europe, has followed the same pattern the Nile once traced: expansion, brilliance, decay. Yet few learned what Kush seemed to know instinctively, that permanence is an illusion and continuity a choice. The kingdom's secret was not how to rule, but how to return to stillness when ruling was done. Its greatness lay not in domination, but in acceptance. In this way, Kush speaks across ages to every civilization that fears its own impermanence. It reminds us that endurance is not the same as survival. Endurance is grace in transformation. The people of Meroë did not cling to empire when the world shifted beneath them. They followed the river, listening to its rhythm, adapting their temples and their faith to each new current. Their silence was not retreat but evolution. To live as they did was to move with the current of time, not against it. In the philosophy of many cultures, from the Taoists of China to the Stoics of Greece, wisdom begins where desire ends. Kush arrived at that place long before its name was forgotten. The silence of its ruins is the same silence that monks seek in their cells, that poets hear between lines, that the ocean holds between waves. It is the space where continuity lives, not in monuments or power, but in the calm pulse of being. Even its art teaches this lesson. The faces carved in Meroitic stone carry an expression beyond joy or sorrow, a serenity that belongs to those who have seen both and found balance. The lines are gentle, the eyes half closed, as if the figures are listening inward. These statues do not proclaim divinity, they contain it. They show humanity in harmony with what cannot be owned, the eternal rhythm beneath form. To look at them is to feel the distance between ambition and peace, Across continents, travelers and scholars who have stood among those ruins describe a similar sensation. The sense of being measured by time, not measuring it. The desert does not reveal Kush easily. It waits for stillness. One must walk slowly, breathe slowly, and let the mind quiet before the shapes of pyramids begin to emerge from the heat. It is as though the kingdom chooses when to appear. A civilization teaching even in its absence the art of attention. Perhaps this is why Kush now feels more modern than many of the empires that succeeded it. In a world of constant noise and haste, its calm offers perspective. Where others built to shout their permanence, Kush built to whisper eternity. Its ruins remind us that silence can outlast speech, and that meaning is not made by size but by intention. The pyramids of Meroë are smaller than those of Giza, yet they have survived longer, their stones less broken, their solitude more complete. In the wider arc of humanity, Kush is a mirror. It reflects our endless attempt to reconcile progress with purpose, memory with impermanence. We invent cities of glass and steel, and yet the lesson remains the same. All brilliance fades, but what we do in harmony with the world endures. The river still flows because it never resists its own course. The kingdom that understood that truth still lingers not as relic but as rhythm. Some philosophers call this the aesthetics of endurance, the beauty of things that know how to last by yielding. It is the curve of a dune reshaped by wind, the patience of a mountain, the quiet persistence of a story retold in new tongues. Kush belongs to that lineage. It reminds us that history is not a contest of victories but a conversation across time, and that the most eloquent voices are often those that learned how to listen. There is an old Sudanese saying, "The desert teaches what the river forgets." Perhaps that is the essence of the Silent Kingdom. The balance between flow and stillness, between change and memory. The river carried Kush to greatness. The desert preserved it. Together they form the two halves of the same lesson. Move when you must, rest when you can, and speak only when the silence has ripened into truth. As the world today rushes toward its own uncertainties, rising seas, shifting climates, fragile empires of economy and technology, the quiet wisdom of Kush feels strangely urgent. It asks no audience, demands no conversion. It simply waits, in stone and shadow, to remind us what endures when everything else has passed. At dusk, when the sun sets behind the pyramids, the air turns bronze and the sand glows from within. The light lasts only a moment, then fades into the cool of evening. In that brief silence between day and night, one feels the whole story of the kingdom distilled. Rise, radiance, retreat. The same breath that once built empires now exhales into peace. And perhaps that is all history truly is. The world learning again and again how to return to silence. Some histories we read, others we walk through. At Meroë, the past does not live in books, it lingers in the air. The horizon is a line of ochre and light, the sand murmurs underfoot, the pyramids rise abruptly from the emptiness, like thoughts that refuse to fade. They do not demand attention, they simply exist, patient and complete. To walk among them is to feel watched, not by ghosts, but by memory itself. The people who live nearby called this place Bajrawiya. Their villages stand only a few kilometers from the ancient necropolis. From their doorways, they see the tips of the pyramids shimmer each morning. a familiar silhouette against the rising sun. To them, the ruins are not distant antiquity, they are neighbors. Children herd goats through the dunes where kings once rode. Women gather sand from the same riverbanks where priests once bathed before dawn. The past has become landscape, a presence so constant it feels like family. Occasionally, travelers arrive. They come from Khartoum or farther, their cars leaving trails of dust that glitter in the light. When they step out, the wind meets them first. Warm, dry, carrying a faint scent of iron. They lower their voices instinctively as if entering a temple. No signs tell them to. The silence of the place teaches its own etiquette. A few take photographs. Most simply stand and look, uncertain where to begin. Time seems to flatten here. Every direction feels like both origin and ending. Archaeologists move quietly among the ruins, measuring, sketching, brushing sand from inscriptions. They speak in low tones, their faces weathered by the same sun that bleached the stone. To them, every fragment is a conversation begun centuries ago and interrupted only by time. One describes finding a piece of pottery still bearing fingerprints, the ridges of a craftsman long vanished. It was like shaking hands with someone who never stopped existing, he says. The discovery of Kush is not a matter of conquest or science, it is communion. At night, the desert changes. The heat dissolves, the air cools, and the stars emerge in impossible abundance. Those who camp near the pyramids often speak of the sound of the wind moving through their chambers, producing tones that shift with each gust. A natural music, accidental yet deliberate. Some hear it as whisper, others as breath. It is not imagination. The pyramids are shaped to echo, their proportions create harmony with the air. Even in ruin, the architecture remembers its purpose, to turn emptiness into voice. In the nearby village, a teacher named Salma tells her students stories about the queens of old. She describes Amanirenas and Amanishaketo not as distant monarchs, but as kin. They walked this ground, she says, and we walk after them. The children listen wide-eyed, their faces half in shadow, half in firelight. When she points toward the horizon, the pyramids seem to glow faintly beneath the moon. The silence of the kingdom becomes lesson, heritage, promise. For others, the connection is more solitary. A traveler from Cairo writes in her notebook, "Here I learn that ruins are not broken things, but things still speaking in another language." She sits for hours beneath the shadow of a pyramid sketching. A shepherd passes, nods, says nothing. The wind carries the same sound it has carried for millennia. Time folds. The act of seeing becomes an act of listening. Sudanese poets often describe the desert as a mirror for the soul. The emptier it appears, the more it reflects. Standing among the remains of Kush, one begins to understand. The silence is not absence, but amplification. It holds the weight of every story that has ever crossed this land. The laughter of markets, the hymns of temples, the cries of war, the quiet of evening prayers. To those who can listen, it is all still there, layered like sediment. One archaeologist once said that Meroë is less a sight than an emotion. It changes the speed of your thoughts, she explained. You begin to think as the stones do, slowly, without anxiety, without need for conclusion. That perhaps is the secret of the Silent Kingdom. It does not tell you what to believe. It allows you to feel what remains. Its wisdom arrives through stillness, not instruction. In the cool hours before dawn, when the desert turns silver, a traveler might see faint footprints around the pyramids, some left by animals, others by people. The sand covers them quickly, but for a moment they are visible, the newest layer of an unending pattern. Every step joins a procession of centuries. The kingdom is still receiving visitors. It is still teaching patience. Back in Khartoum, in the museums and archives, the same feeling persists. Scholars pore over inscriptions they cannot yet read, tracing the loops of Meroitic letters with their fingers. We are listening to a voice that has not yet chosen to speak, one researcher says. Her tone carries neither frustration nor urgency, only reverence. To study Kush is to accept that understanding may come slowly, or not at all, and that this too is knowledge. For those who live along the Nile, the Silent Kingdom is not myth but mirror. Its pyramids reflect the constancy of the river, the resilience of people who have endured drought, war, and exile, yet still plant crops each season with unbroken faith. The lesson of Kush lives in them, in their patience, their dignity, their ability to begin again. And so, as the world spins faster, as its cities rise higher and its noise grows louder, there remains this one stretch of desert where silence still reigns without surrender. It asks nothing, offers everything, and waits for whoever will listen long enough to hear themselves inside it, because perhaps that is the truest meaning of the Silent Kingdom, that to encounter the past is to encounter one's own reflection, not as history written, but as presence remembered. Night falls slowly over the desert. The air cools, the light dissolves, and the sand turns the color of ash. Above the horizon, the first stars appear, cautious and steady, like embers remembering fire. The pyramids of Meroë stand motionless in their vigil, their tips outlined against the fading sky. They have watched 10,000 sunsets and learned that beauty does not fade. It changes its form. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the Nile still breathes. Its waters slide through the dark like thought itself, carrying fragments of moonlight and memory. Along its banks, the ghosts of temples and cities sleep beneath the soil. Napata, Kawa, Gebel Barkal. The same stars that once shone on their altars now gaze upon quiet villages where children dream beside the sound of the same river. The centuries have folded together until time here feels less like a sequence than a single endless pulse. If one listens long enough, the desert begins to speak, not in words, but in rhythm. The wind moves softly over the stones, tracing the same paths priests once walked, carrying the same tones that once echoed through courtyards of incense and gold. Even the silence has texture, fine as dust, heavy as memory. It is the same silence the kingdom was born from. The silence that outlasted conquest. The silence that remains when every voice has finished saying what it must. It is said that the ancients of Kush believed in 3 kinds of time. The time of men fleeting as flame, the time of the earth, vast and patient, and the time of the gods, which is not time at all but stillness. Standing among their ruins, one can feel all 3 converging. The brief spark of our presence, the deep endurance of stone, and the still eternity between them. Perhaps that is the truest inheritance they left behind. The reminder that meaning does not reside in duration but in attention. The archaeologists will continue to dig. The scholars will debate, translate, measure. Nations will rise and fall as they always have, yet the essence of Kush will remain beyond all that, alive not in libraries but in the hush between thought and breath. For what they built was never only of stone, it was of silence shaped into form, of faith turned into rhythm. They understood that civilization is not what resists time, but what listens to it. Somewhere deep beneath the sand, a royal tomb lies sealed. Inside, a single oil lamp once burned. Its flame is gone, but on the walls around it painted figures still stand unbroken. Queens and gods, lions and stars. Their colors remain bright because no light has touched them for 2,000 years. That is how memory survives, by retreating into darkness until the world is ready to see again. Above ground, the night deepens. The pyramids seem to draw closer to the stars, as if answering them. For a moment, the line between heaven and earth disappears, the desert becomes sky. The constellations shift as they did in the time of Paye and Taharqa, though no eye now marks their progress. The gods of the Nile and the lions of Meroë sleep in the same vast silence. And in that silence the listener begins to feel weightless, as if floating somewhere between history and dream. Perhaps this is why the story of Kush endures, because it never asks to be believed, only to be felt. Its truth lies not in dates or conquests, but in the tenderness of persistence, the way a people can vanish yet remain, the way silence can be more eloquent than empire. To remember Kush is to remember that greatness can be gentle, and that even the quietest voices echo longest. The wind drifts through the pyramids again, carrying the faint scent of dust and myrrh. It sounds like breath, like distant water, like the whisper of something that does not wish to be explained. You might imagine it saying, "Do not mourn what is gone. Everything returns, the river flows, the stars move, the stone remembers." And so the story returns to where it began, to the Nile, winding through the heart of Africa, ancient and eternal. Its surface reflects both past and sky, so that one cannot tell which direction time is flowing. The same current that once bore the ships of pharaohs now carries the reflections of satellites, clouds, and drifting leaves. It makes no distinction. It accepts all things as the kingdom once did. If you listen now, beneath the slow rhythm of your own heartbeat, you might hear it. The soft pulse of that distant water, older than memory, steady as breath. It reminds you that all stories are the same story, all empires the same lesson, all silences the same invitation. And when the last sound fades and the last thought quiets and only the hush of wind remains, you understand what the people of Kush must have known, that the end of a kingdom is not the end of its voice. That silence is not loss, it is continuation. And that history, like the Nile, never truly stops. It only changes its depth. The night grows deeper, the pyramids stand against the stars, small and eternal. The desert holds its breath, and somewhere in that stillness, the Silent Kingdom dreams again. You've been listening to the Silent Kingdom of Kush, a meditation on history, memory, and the eternal rhythm of the Nile. Thank you for drifting with us through time. This is Cryptic Realm Channel. If you wish to wander deeper into the echoes of forgotten worlds, subscribe and let the silence carry you home.